Okay, hello, you are watching video lecture number 32. This is New Social Classes and Cultures. We've got a few sections we are covering today. The first is the business elite, then we'll look at the middle class, and then urban workers and the poor, and then this idea of the benevolent empire, Charles Grandison Finney, Revivalism and Reform, and then lastly, immigration and cultural conflict. So economic changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution necessarily affected the social structure and social values of most Americans. New machinery and new ways of organizing labor had resulted in unparalleled economic growth and national prosperity. But such advances often came at the expense of personal and communal contentment. To be sure, opportunities for individual advancement were multiplied, but the riches generated by the new economy were not shared equally. Orestes A. Brownson contended that the condition of the poor wage laborers of the North was truly worse than that of the slaves in the South. Alexis de Tocqueville agreed that the rise of the industrial economy in the democratic United States had resulted in perhaps unavoidable inequalities between masters and workers. Furthermore, in a fluid society with no artificial distinctions, a kind of restlessness in the pursuit of wealth had become nearly universal. Okay, so let's take a closer look at all of these sections today, starting with the business elite. The Industrial Revolution shattered the traditional rural social order and created a society composed of distinct regions, classes, and cultures. In the large cities, the richest 1% of the population owned 40% of all tangible property, and an even larger share of the stocks and bonds. The government taxed tangible property, but almost never taxed stocks, bonds, or inheritances. Thus, government policies allowed the rich to accumulate even more wealth at the expense of the poor. The wealthiest families then began to consciously set themselves apart, and many American cities became segregated communities divided geographically along the lines of class, race, and ethnicity. Okay, so let's move to the next section, which is the middle class. A distinct middle class culture emerged as the per capita income of Americans rose about 2.5% per year between 1830 and the Panic of 1857. Middle class Americans secured material comfort for themselves and education for their children, and they stressed things like discipline, morality, and hard work. The business elite and the middle class celebrated this idea of work as the key to a higher standard of living for the nation and for social mobility for the individual. The ideal of the self-made man became a central theme of American popular culture. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at the urban workers and the poor. The bottom 10% of the labor force, the casual workers, owned little or no property, and their jobs were unpredictable, they were seasonal, or they were very dangerous. Other laborers had greater job security, but few prospered. Many families sent their children out to work, and the death of one parent, if it were to happen, often pushed that family into dire poverty. Over time, urban factory workers and unskilled laborers lived in well-defined neighborhoods of crowded boarding houses or tiny apartments, often with filthy conditions. Many of these wage earners turned to alcohol as a form of solace, and bars and saloons and brothels appeared on almost every block in working class districts, and police were unable to contain the lawlessness that eventually occurred. So this brings us to the benevolent empire. During the 1820s, Congregational and Presbyterian ministers linked with merchants and their wives to launch a program of social reform and regulation. It's called the Benevolent Empire. and it targeted drunkenness and other social ills, but it also set out to industrialize or institutionalize charity and to combat evil in a systematic fashion. The benevolent groups encouraged people to live well-disciplined lives, and they established institutions to assist those in need and to control those people who were considered threats to society. Upper-class women were an important part of the benevolent empire through sponsorship of charitable organizations. Now, some reformers believed that one of the greatest threats to morality was the decline of the traditional Sabbath, and so they did everything they could to reinstate the Sabbath as a tradition. Popular resistance or indifference limited the success of this movement called the Benevolent Empire. That brings us to Charles Grandison Finney, Revivalism and Reform. He was a Presbyterian minister, Charles Grandison Finney, and he conducted emotional revivals that stressed conversion rather than instruction. Finney's ministry drew on and accelerated the Second Great Awakening. Finney's message that man was able to choose salvation was particularly attractive to the middle class. Finney wanted to humble the pride of the rich and relieve the shame of the poor by celebrating their common fellowship in Christ. The business elite joined what was called the Cold Water movement then, and they established savings banks and Sunday schools for the poor and helped to provide relief for the unemployed. These initiatives to create a harmonious community of morally disciplined Christians were not altogether effective. Skilled workers argued for higher wages, more than sermons and prayers, and Finney's revival seldom attracted poor people, especially Irish Catholics. Revivalists from New England to the Midwest copied Finney's evangelical message and his techniques, and the movement swept through places such as Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Tennessee, and eventually Indiana. Something else, the temperance movement proved to be the most effective arena for evangelical social reform. And the American Temperance Society adapted methods that worked well in the revivals and helped the consumption of spirits or alcohol to fall dramatically. Evangelical reformers celebrated religion as the moral foundation of the American work ethic. Religion and the ideology of social mobility held society together in the face of the disarray created by the market economy, industrial enterprise, and cultural diversity. Okay, so let's look more into this diversity with immigration and cultural conflict. Between 1840 and 60, millions of immigrants, Irish, Germans, and Britons, poured into the United States. Most of them avoided the South, and many Germans moved to states in the Midwest, while other Germans and most of the Irish settled in the Northeast. The most prosperous of these immigrants, however, were the British, followed by the Germans, and then the poorest of these were from Ireland. Many Germans and most Irish were Catholics who fueled the growth of the Catholic Church in America. Now, because of the Protestant religious fervor that was stirred up by the Second Great Awakening, these Catholic immigrants met with widespread hostility. In 1834, Samuel F. B. Morse published Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, which warned of a Catholic threat to American Republican institutions. Anti-Catholic sentiment continued to intensify. Mobs of unemployed workers attacked Catholics, and the Native American clubs called for limits on immigration. Social reformers often supported the anti-Catholic movement because they wanted to prevent the diversion of tax resources to Catholic schools and to oppose alcohol abuse by Irish men. In most large northeastern cities, then, differences of class and culture led to violence and split the North, similar to the way that race and class had divided the South. Okay, this does conclude today's video lecture. Please address the review questions at the bottom of the screen and continue on with your studies.